Well, look, Tony Blair always said that changing the facts on the ground was never sufficient in itself. You can only make real progress if there is also a political horizon that is operating as well. That said, I do think that all of us on the panel would recognise that the fact that the Palestinians have had more control over their territories, the work that Salam Fayyad has been leading in reforming the Palestinian security forces, the way in which you've seen improvements in the economic activity of certain areas of the West Bank, like around Jenin.
It's a very well-run occupied territory.
Good things. Well, what you've seen is you've seen greater Palestinian economic activity. You've seen good growth in the West Bank's economy. Is it sufficient? No. Is it enough without a political horizon? No. But I don't think we should dismiss the work that has been led by Prime Minister Salam Fayyad under the Palestinian Authority in getting the Palestinians ready for statehood. I think that's important work.
All right, so the newspaper Haaretz in Israel did obtain a copy of the letter President Abbas had intended to send to the Israeli Prime Minister. This is a portion of it. He said, "We entered a contractual agreement with international backing in order to bring the Palestinian people from occupation to independence. Currently, and as a result of the policy of consecutive Israeli governments, the Palestinian Authority has no real control over political, economic, geographic or security-related issues." Robert Malley, I mean, isn't that an accurate summary then of the PA from Mahmoud Abbas himself, despite all of this marvelous...
I think in response to what Matthew said, which is a fair point, I mean, I suspect Palestinians are living better today than before the Palestinian Authority had developed the institutions it's developed. But in terms of a political instrument, I think it's a fair question to ask whether, in fact, it is perpetuating the occupation, and therefore is at war with the political horizon that the Quartet and Salam and others want to put forward, whether it's consistent with it, because as long as you could maintain the status quo cheaply, on the cheap from Israel's point of view, and as long as things are running, as you say, quite well, where's the incentive to change it? So I think there is a real fundamental, there's always been this fundamental contradiction in the Palestinian strategy between building a state before you have independence and fighting for your independence, because building the state is synonymous with the status quo, with making sure things are stable. Sometimes to fight for your independence, you have to shake things up.
So Mahmoud Abbas then did drop for the moment.
I think if we look at this...
Go ahead, yes. Matthew.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think if we look at this situation, one thing we know is that the status quo is never where you think it is, not least if we look at what's happening with relation to Gaza, which we haven't mentioned yet. So I think this idea that anybody is under the illusion that there is somehow a status quo that can be maintained is wrong.
It's been maintained for a long time, I mean, with ups and downs. But this reminds me of when Secretary Clinton said the status quo is unsustainable, and then she added, maybe it won't, it will last another year, maybe 2 years, maybe 30 years. Yes, of course, at some point, everything will change. But it has been sustainable for long enough that at this point it's the most likely thing to continue unless something changes.
We now know that Abbas will not then be calling anytime soon for the dissolution of the PA. He'll go to the UN General Assembly. He'll ask for to become an observer state as opposed to an observer entity and so forth. Perhaps Yossi Beilin suggested dissolution might be on the cards at some other point. All of this after pressure from President Obama. Should we, again, this all does sound very familiar, doesn't it, Diana, as we talk of the status quo, whether a status quo exists, or at least a pattern of status quo existing?
This has been the long pattern for many, many, many years. I mean, the idea that back in 2009, Mahmoud Abbas declared that he was going to dissolve the PA, again in 2010, again in 2011, now again in 2012. If he's going to do it, do it. But it's clear to me that he's not about to proceed down that path. What is clear, however, is that the United States is not going to do anything about this, and that the status quo is going to remain exactly as it is, whether that's in the Gaza Strip or whether it's in the West Bank. Nothing is going to change.
We do have this flurry of activity, though, which, again, we get from time to time. We have the Quartet meeting. We have various other measures apparently going on behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the eviction of settlers from a Palestinian apartment in the city of Hebron, which was seen as a good sign. But meanwhile, he also said he would submit a plan that would formalize the status of 3 illegal West Bank settler outposts built more than a decade ago without state permission. And last Wednesday, the Israeli Prime Minister said his government will strengthen Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Here's what he had to say.
This is the principle that guides us. We are strengthening the Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria, and we are strengthening the Jewish settlement in Hebron, the city of our fathers. It is not less important for me, but there is another principle which we follow. We do all of this according to the law, and we will continue to do so.
Judea and Samaria, of course, meaning the West Bank. It's not a bad moment to go through some maps at this point, which show where the Israeli and Palestinian territories were before 1967 versus now. These are some maps from the group Americans for Peace Now. Here's the territory where Palestinians lived before the '67 war. After the war, illegal Israeli settlements began to expand at a rapid rate. But this is what makes up the Palestinian territories now in the dark shading. And now you can see the extent to which settlements have taken over even that area. So there we are. This is what's been happening. This is what continues to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu invoking law as he expands the settlements. Matthew Doyle, again, can one forgive many parties in this who are involved in these negotiations? Say, look, this is over. The two-state solution is over. Look at that map. There's just no way that's going to happen. It's now time to look at far more radical alternatives.
Well, I'm not quite sure what people mean when they say more radical alternatives.
Or realistic alternatives.
If you look at what the public on both sides wants, it's clear that the public on both sides still wants a situation where you have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Now, it's also true that if you ask them the credibility of whether they think that's going to come about, they are, to put it mildly, sceptical. That's why getting back to a situation where there is at least some engagement between the parties is so important. That's what the Quartet set out in their statement last September. I'm sure it's what tomorrow's meeting will focus on. We've seen various bits of activity happening under the auspices of the Jordanians. I hope it's going to lead to more such engagement, because ultimately this is only going to be solved by direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians sitting down with one another.
Robert Malley, you're not an advocate for a one-state solution, but you argue that perhaps the best that can be hoped for, at least you did in an article in February, I think, was that the Israelis might withdraw from more populated areas of the West Bank. All the major settlement blocks would exist, and then maybe there'd be some Israeli military presence in the Jordanian Valley. Really? I mean, isn't that just another interim?
I wasn't advocating it. I was
but
saying
the most
this
likely,
is the
perhaps,
well,
right?
because, listen, when people say they should go back to talks, nobody truly believes that I know, truly believes that by going back to talks, you're going to achieve a breakthrough, to achieve two-state solution, least of all those who are proposing it. But they're doing it for maintenance and because everyone has become addicted to this process. Now, where you go from, instead of that, as you hinted, I think a one-state solution, people who advocate it either are doing it tactically because they want to scare Israel, or they're peddling a bit of an illusion because you can't have a solution that one of the two sides adamantly rejects. So it may be, we now have a one-state outcome. It may be an outcome. It's not going to be a solution that both sides are going to be comfortable with. So where do you go from there? I think that's a big question. As I said, the most likely outcome from an Israeli point of view, I think we've heard it already, is that if things continue this way, they may decide under pressure because they don't want to continue to rule over the Palestinians, but they don't want to give them the kind of deal that they would accept, that they will withdraw unilaterally from some areas. It's not ideal. It certainly doesn't end the conflict. It perpetuates it, but it may be where we go next, given where we are today.
Is that an acceptable outcome, Diana?
No. Look, if you look back to 20 years ago, there were very few Israelis who were even willing to support the idea of a two-state settlement. So I think we're much better off pushing for this idea of one state rather than two states, because it's become clear that you cannot unscramble an egg. There are now more than 600,000 Israeli settlers. By settlement accounts, there are now 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. The Israeli government cannot evacuate one house in Hebron without a huge ruckus. What's to say that they're going to be able to evacuate 600,000 settlers? In other words, rather than us demanding that these settlers be evacuated and pushing for a reconfiguration of borders, etc., what we should instead be demanding is that the system of privilege that exists in Israel, that be disbanded, and that we push for one person, one vote, where each person has equality.
But is that a negotiating tactic, as Robert was suggesting, though? I mean, are you still doing that in a way to pressure Israel into, agreeing to a contiguous Palestinian state, or is that just that whole idea simply over now?
I think that the idea is over. There are some Palestinian negotiators who have in the past used it as a threatening tactic. I think people are moving beyond the threat tactics and are looking at this in terms of reality. The reality is that the land has never been historically divided successfully, and we have to be able to move forward. Palestinians want to be able to be free, and it's simply not going to happen under this configuration of a two-state settlement.
Robert Malley, I mean, the US role in all this is key, and that's one of the reasons why there's this throwing hands up in the air. And the suggestion is, and I think there is a sense that Israel is worried about how it's seen internationally. If it's no longer seen as a partner of peace, but seen as as a legally occupying power over the Palestinian territory, over the West Bank, that will make a difference, especially without any US pressure to do anything or to change any policy.
I think you're right that even Prime Minister Netanyahu is worried about image, the credibility, the legitimacy of Israel in American and in European and other eyes. But does one really think today, given everything we've seen, including with President Obama, who came to office with great ambition and immediately named George Mitchell as an envoy, does anyone truly believe today that we're going to see in our lifetime an American president?
Not even a second term. I'm sure they'll be dangling that.
There's a lot of mythology about the second term. I mean, what will change that will make the president suddenly, who wasn't able to do it in his first term, suddenly change completely and achieve what he hasn't been able to do? He hasn't been able to move the two parties. He won't have the leverage and the instruments that are necessary at this point to move them if they're not prepared to move. As Matthew said, if they're not prepared to move in the way that the president was, he won't be able to exercise that pressure. And even if that kind of pressure existed, the political system in this country won't make it realistic for him to do so. So I think it's best for Israelis and Palestinians to give up on the illusion. There are many illusions they have to give up on, but one of them is that the United States at some point is going to step in with a magical solution that's going to save everyone. It's not going to happen, and if it is going to happen, let them be satisfied when it happens, but their strategy needs to be developed now on the basis of the fact that it is the most unlikely of scenarios that the U.S. suddenly is going to be able to forcefully act and bring about a solution it hasn't been able to bring about so far.
Last word, Diana, very quickly there, but despite all this, though, do you really expect anything to change in the coming years at all?
Look, I wouldn't be surprised if things do change. I think that the status quo is going to remain the same for a little bit of time. But Palestinians are, they've proven time and again that they aren't happy with the status quo.
All right, Diana Buttu, thank you very much. Robert Malley and Matthew Doyle, thank you too in New York. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.